Sherlock Holmes is one of the most iconic literary characters of all time, and now that I have finally met him in A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I can totally see why. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education. And one way that I'm doing that was finally diving into detective fiction and golden age detective fiction. And you can't even say the words detective fiction without thinking about Sherlock Holmes. And it was high time that I finally met the inspector himself. And the very first book that I read in order to do that was, of course, A Study in Scarlet. This is the very first book in the Sherlock Holmes series. This is where we actually meet Sherlock Holmes for the first time, and I had so much fun reading this book. So in A Study in Scarlet, we're actually following the perspective of Dr. Watson. He's just returned home from the war and he needs a place to stay. And so a mutual acquaintance connects him with Sherlock Holmes, who is this very quirky man that no one else really wants to room with, but Dr. Watson finds him so intriguing that he says, why not? And they become roommates, and that is how Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson became the famous duo. And as Dr. Watson gets to learn more about Sherlock Holmes, he's so fascinated with this quirky character, and I think that's something I loved the most about A Study in Scarlet, is Sherlock Holmes is very definitive in his character, in the things that he likes and in the things that he cares about. And Dr. Watson is writing this story. It's actually in the perspective of Dr. Watson's journal. And what I loved is one point where he records kind of the characteristics of Sherlock Holmes. And I'm just going to read this to you because I found it so funny. Sherlock Holmes, his limits. 1. Knowledge of literature, nil. 2. Knowledge of philosophy, nil. Knowledge of astronomy, nil. Knowledge of politics, feeble. Knowledge of botany, variable. Well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally. Knows nothing of practical gardening. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. And I'm skipping a few here just to get to the point. But knowledge of sensational literature, immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. Number 10, he plays the violin well. 12, has a good practical knowledge of British law. I just thought that was so funny that Sherlock Holmes has such a character that the things that matter to him and the things that don't. And as a homeschool mom, I highlighted this specific quote. Dr. Watson says, "But the solar system," I protested, and Sherlock responds with, "What the deuce is it to me?" He interrupted impatiently. "You say that we go round the sun? If we went round the moon, it would not make a pennyworth of difference to me or to my work." I just thought that was hilarious because, in education, it seems like we need to know it all, like everything is important, everything is valuable. And while that's true to some extent, at the end of the day, whatever our pursuits are in life and whatever our passions are in life, we're going to pursue that type of knowledge, and that's the kind of thing that's going to matter to us, and the rest is going to be take it or leave it. So I kind of actually found a little bit of solace in that as a homeschool mom. I kind of reflected on my own education, and I thought, you know what, I actually don't remember a lot of what I learned other than what is practicable in my own life here in the present. So I found that interesting. But in the first half of the book, in A Study in Scarlet, we're meeting Sherlock Holmes, and then Dr. Watson starts to follow him on this case. And Sherlock Holmes, his kind of defining thing is that he is the world's very first consulting detective. So when other detectives cannot solve a case, they come to him. And his key trait is this thing he calls the science of deduction, and that's really being able to see everything in a situation in order to solve the mystery. And I thought it was incredibly fascinating. However, I'll say as a reader, that fact about him makes it very hard to solve the mystery on your own. If you're reading Sherlock Holmes, I don't know that you would be able to do that, because Sherlock Holmes reveals things throughout the mystery that you just wouldn't have known until he reveals them to you. But I found it fascinating just how the story was told in that way. So at first I was a little bit put off. I was like, well, how am I supposed to solve this with all these things I don't know? But then, kind of like the perspective of Dr. Watson, I was just intrigued with it. I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. That's really clever. It almost feels like you're working a case backwards, which was really fun. But A Study in Scarlet is broke up into two parts, and that first part is Dr. Watson following Sherlock Holmes on this case. And then all of a sudden, right when Sherlock Holmes reveals just how he found everything out and he found the person who did it, the story stops and it swaps over to the most random story, and you're like, what is going on? And at first I was really confused, and I was like, am I reading something else? Because I have a treasury of Sherlock Holmes, and I was like, did it skip some pages or what? I was just a little bit confused. But it turns out that that story leads into what happened with the other story. And once I kept going with it, I was just as invested in part 2 and that storyline as I was in the beginning. It feels different. It feels a little bit more like an adventurous love story, but it's pretty short, so don't think that Sherlock Holmes is really long. This is a treasury of Sherlock Holmes, which has a ton of stories in it, but I was invested in that second story, and as I was finally putting the pieces together, how things might have connected, it was like that aha moment, and I absolutely loved it. So, without further ado, I'm going to be reading more Sherlock Holmes. There's so many Sherlock Holmes stories that I'm not really sure where to go next, but if you want to meet Sherlock Holmes for the first time, then you want to read A Study in Scarlet, because this is how Dr. Watson is introduced to him, and this is how you as a reader can be introduced to him in the same way. So I'm not sure exactly what Sherlock Holmes I should go with next. If you have a suggestion, I would love to hear it, because I would love to read more of it. I thought this was so fun. I thought the friendship between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes was great. And then, like I said, just almost being able to solve a mystery backwards by the way that Sherlock Holmes does it was great. So, I highly recommend, if you've never read any Sherlock Holmes, to start out with A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That is all I have, friends. Happy reading, and I will see you next time.